Prerna comes to us with an interesting background. Her undergraduate degree is in English literature, and then she did a master's in media and cultural studies at one of the leading social science research institutes in India. And she also has a background of activism and media work. Even as an undergraduate, she was part of the Indian Coalition for Nuclear Disarmament and Peace. And she ran a website called India Resists with others. And she's also very interested in filmmaking and documentary filmmaking in particular. And she has a Public Scholars Initiative Award to make a documentary on the subject of her thesis, which she'll tell us much more about. Over to you, Prerna.
Thank you, Ramana, for that introduction. Hi, everyone. I'm very excited today to share a part of my thesis with you. Sorry, 1 second, just setting this up here. Okay, so but before I start, I wanted to talk a little bit about my research interests. So right now, in the context of climate change and ever-increasing demand for energy in a developing country like India, the Indian government has some pretty big decisions to make in terms of energy policy. And in one response to the situation, they have announced massive plans for the expansion of nuclear energy, and they aim to increase it threefold, so from 7 gigawatts right now to 22 gigawatts in the next 10 years by 2031. But every nuclear project in India since the 1980s has met with protests and opposition from local communities, which have in turn faced a lot of repression from the state. And this conflict is one of the reasons I was drawn to my research. It led me to ask what drives people's preferences for energy technologies, specifically nuclear energy. How are the risks and benefits from nuclear energy perceived by people? And how do their own social, cultural, and political values play into making these decisions? And I'm interested in this because I believe that environmental policy should be informed by people's values. Even though there is a huge push towards technical and scientific expertise to inform environmental policy, I think this is not enough. And I think policy should reflect the socio-political context of which they are part of. And I will be arguing for that through the case study of India's oldest uranium mines. And these uranium mines are located in this very mineral-rich state of Jharkhand. They are also the largest domestic supplier for uranium for nuclear power plants in India. And since the 1990s, they have been mired in controversy. They are suspected of having caused some adverse health effects on mine workers and the communities that live nearby these mines. But before we jump into the controversy, I want to give you a brief history of this area. These mines are located on indigenous land, or Adivasi land, as they are called in India. Since independence, Adivasis have demanded this separate state of Jharkhand so that they could have more political autonomy. However, they continue to be displaced for mining projects and other developmental projects. And over time, they have joined together to form movements that ask for compensation for displacement by asking for jobs in these very mines. And the same thing happened for uranium mines in Jadugora. The activists there were asking for jobs in these mines as a compensation for being displaced. However, in early 1990s, there was the historic World Uranium hearing that happened in Salzburg, Australia. And in this, there were speakers that came across from all different continents, including indigenous speakers, health practitioners, scientists, and they testified to the health and environmental impacts of uranium mining all over the world. This hearing came to Jadugora, and people started becoming aware of the effects that uranium mining can have. And so they decided to change the agenda from demanding jobs to a complete stop on uranium mining. And they went around the community collecting testimonies to see what kind of health impacts people were seeing in their surroundings. And so these are some of the extracts from these testimonies that activists recorded. We see people thought that when women passed around these mines, they would have miscarriages, and they blamed that on evil spirits or ghosts in that area. Elders said that they had not seen the kind of diseases that they were seeing now, things like jaws and teeth of the cattle falling out and rotting. Workers observed that when they were cut by the mine rocks, that their wounds would not heal very quickly. And a local midwife observes that there were not as many abnormal babies or miscarriages as there are now. And she reports in 1992 an unusual rate for babies being born without their skull without being completely formed. And this condition is known as anencephaly, and it is a rare disease. It happens in 1 in 10,000 birds, but she observed that it was happening for 1 in 10 babies in Jadugora. So media has reported the things that people are observing for the last 2 decades. However, UCIL, or the Uranium Corporation, the state-owned company that looks after uranium mines here, has denied these claims and said that these are myths, being myths rather than facts, which they, as the expert authority, claim to have on the subject. There's a section on the website called Myths of UCIL, and they claim that people's apprehensions about uranium mining is because they do not understand radiation, or they do not understand how uranium mining works. So what UCIL's claim show is an emphasis on a gap, which is known as the public subjective perception of risk and experts' objective assessment of risk. And the argument goes that experts make evidence-based risk assessments, which are based on statistics, which are based on things like annual fatality rates, whereas public is seen to rely upon perceptions which are based on emotions or and are often seen as irrational. And even after a lot of social science analysis has rejected this notion, it continues to persist in media, in popular discourse, and even among scholars of risk. And in this paper, I will be challenging that through the case study of Jadugora. I will be extending 3 arguments. The first one is that risk definitions and assessments, as they're often seen as, they're not as unanimous as they're often perceived. Experts often dispute each other's risk definitions. They argue about the methodologies that should be used. And in that, I will be talking about two debates in Jadugora. One is on how to measure radiation levels, and other one is on how to measure the health impacts from the mine. Second one is that people also make rational judgments which are based on their social experience of the institutions that are responsible for creating and managing risks. And in that, I will be talking about UCIL's management of Jadugora and the limitations that exist to regulating these mines in India. Thirdly, I will be talking about the fact that expert decisions are also not free of politics or value judgments. They are part of institutions that also exist in political contexts. And in this, I will be talking about the kind of narratives that Uranium Corporation and the nuclear establishment at large has been propagating with regard to the controversy in Jadugora, which includes the kind of stereotypes about backward and unhygienic Adivasi. And the second is anything that is seen to oppose nuclear energy or nuclear projects in India is seen to be against the nation itself. So moving forward towards the debate on measuring radiation levels. So here, the nuclear establishment has claimed that radiation levels have not increased since uranium mining has happened, and the background radiation levels are within the standard limit. In one instance, in one dramatic instance, the scientific officer from nuclear establishment invites a journalist and takes reading inside the pond where the waste is collected after preliminary kind of processing. And they show that yes, inside the pond, the radiation readings were high, but as you go outside, they fall back to normal. And so there was nothing to be concerned about for people. However, these readings were challenged by physicist and nuclear activist Surendra Gadekar. He had some experience of doing these kind of surveys in Gujarat, where a lot of India's nuclear tests had been nuclear weapons had been tested. And there is an interesting incident that he recounts in his publication, which is that one day while we were doing data collection during the survey, Dr. Jha himself arrived and complained that we had been publicizing falsehood with regard to radiation readings in the neighborhood. The upshot of the discussion was that I agreed to accompany him and take joint readings. Just outside his office was a pile of rocks. The readings there were 3 times higher than the ones we had been taking. I asked him why he did not take readings near this pile or many other piles spread all over Jadugora. His answer was that this was mine overburdened rock and readings near such piles were bound to be higher. And this Surendra thought was the crux of the controversy. Because radiation readings vary over very small distances, you can take readings in different places and come to very different averages. But he argued that what matters to people is where they live and where they spend their time. So he went to people's houses and the roads they used to walk on and found that a lot of these houses were built from the mine overburden rock that was being sold in that area for cheap or for free. And he calculated the averages there would be at least 50% more than the permissible limit. Similarly, there were debates about the health impacts of the mines and how to calculate them. Independent epidemiological studies suggest that even though the economic status of Jadugora was higher than the nearby control villages, the congenital deformities and stillbirths here were around 4 times higher than control villages. And they also observed a very anomalous high incidence of tuberculosis in Jadugora, which didn't make sense to them. And what they thought was it could be because of misdiagnosis of lung cancer as tuberculosis, which they did not have the resources to prove. However, these studies were criticized by the nuclear establishment. They said that these independent studies do not do clinical confirmations. And their own studies show that there were no abnormal rates of cancer or congenital abnormalities. They said that the health conditions are because of poverty, malnutrition, and unhygienic practices in the Adivasi communities. And the latest studies after 2009 even deny the existence of congenital malformations. However, people continue to report these in media. But one study that I found publicly available shows that clinical confirmations can also have their shortcomings. So I'll be reading an extract from that. From 6,900 households covered during survey, 2,693 were called to the health camps for further screening. From 1,522 who attended the health camp, 220 cases were referred for confirmation of diagnosis. Only 91 cases could complete most of the diagnostic tests. Out of these 91 cases, 56 had been called to rule out or confirm cancer and 35 for congenital anomaly. Of the 56 people, only 1 case of cancer was confirmed. In 38 people, cancer was ruled out, and 17 people could not complete the investigation. From 35 people who had been called to rule out or confirm congenital anomaly, 6 cases of congenital anomaly were confirmed. One of the referred cases died while the investigations were going on. In 28 people, the diagnosis of congenital anomaly was either not sure or the investigations could not be completed. So you see that at every step, a certain amount of the sample was left out, leaving it insignificant to draw any conclusions in the end. And because people were asked to come 20 kilometers away without any promise of treatment for these tests, they were not willing to go that distance. So moving on to the second argument, that people also make judgments based on their social experience of institutions. They were raising concerns about UCIL's management practice. Here you see workers dealing with drums with yellow cake. Yellow cake is a type of uranium concentrate obtained after initial processing of uranium ores. The drums are leaking and the workers are not given enough safety equipment to deal with them. This another picture of a barefoot contract worker who's loading the mine waste onto the trucks without any safety gear. Here, another person is showing a pipe that is going from the mills to the tailing ponds, and it's leaking. The tailing ponds are usually they're left in the open, and sometimes in the dry seasons, the dust goes over to the communities nearby. And children can walk near it, and at times they also play over it. These pictures have been taken by the local activist Ashish Puruli from Jadugora. The other problem is the no independent regulation of these mines. So the regulatory body, Atomic Energy Regulatory Board, it reports to Atomic Energy Commission, which also oversees the Department of Atomic Energy. And the chairman of AEC is also the secretary of the AE. So effectively, the organization that it's supposed to regulate, it is also reporting to. And moreover, DAE also provides a lot of technical support to AERB. So even there's a lot of overlap of personnel in both these organizations, which seriously questions the independence of regulation of these uranium mines. So moving on to the third argument, that experts are not free of politics also. Here I want to go a little bit into the theory of it. The Mary Douglas, who was a cultural anthropologist, is one of the most influential figures in the field of risk. She was interested in understanding ideas of order and disorder in a society, and she found that behind ideas of purity and pollution, and she understood that behind ideas of purity and pollution lie ideas of order and disorder. So pollution rules and taboos are actually protecting a society's social order and hierarchies. And when they are transgressed, the society is seen to be put at danger. And the blame is assigned to someone who is unpopular, so a marginalized identity or an outside enemy. An example of that is if you look at the violence and disgust that queer folks have seen throughout history, it is interesting to it is very quizzical to think about why somebody's personal preferences are seen as so threatening to a society. One explanation is that it questions the neat order between the sexes in a heterosexual society. So the Uranium Corporation and nuclear establishment, they have been creating this, they have been playing into the stereotypical backward image of the Adivasi. And their position hasn't changed since 1999. In 1999, the UCIL's chairman said, malnutrition is the main cause of incidence of tuberculosis and child mortality, and the low level of health among the tribal people. The men are generally healthy until the age of 27. After that, they took to drinking. This, coupled with their poor economic background, resulted in the deterioration of their health. In 2018, they say almost the same thing. Causes for health impacts are economic backwardness, smoking habits, and malnutrition. The uranium mining in the area brought and while adding in the same breath that uranium mining in the area brought economic prosperity to the villagers because it offered employment to them and better services. And so Adivasis, this kind of narrative reveals the hierarchical order of Indian society. Adivasis exist at the lowest rung of this hierarchical order. And this narrative helps shift the blame onto the communities themselves. Secondly, any opposition to India's nuclear program has been labeled as anti-national by the state. In one of the reports that you see here, UCL officials have hinted that the deformed children that are being reported in media have been imported from outside, and have said that this is a conspiracy against India's nuclear program to thwart the country's progress. And Adivasis are also at times, like, they're not just at the lowest rung of the society, a lot of times they're also labeled as the enemies of the state. For instance, the central region of India where there's a struggle for independence by Adivasis is known as Pakistan by the local police. So there are two key takeaways from the story of Jadugora. One is that public is not merely reacting to risks based on their emotions and values, and experts are not merely imparting unbiased risk assessment. in any risk controversy, politicization is inevitable. The actor claiming to be unbiased just probably needs closer scrutiny. Thank you so much. Sorry, I didn't want to do that. Any questions? Yeah.
Very, very interesting. So, given what you interacted with, do you see any path towards empowerment, given how so much of this is improvised and by very powerful interest in certain projects forward? Are there any paths towards empowerment?
I think I personally put all my faith in people's movement. I think people's movement is the only path to empowerment. And I think there's a positive change in Jharkhand at the state, actually, because the current chief minister is indigenous and the party is very supportive of Adivasi values. Yeah, Milind.
You expect, for example, that there will be some who you want to go and but in fact, I'm trying to sort of testing the idea of who the expert is. PCI chairman needed it, and then it's put there by the government. To talk about the way in which the having part of their responsibility for the but where is the sort of academic and scientific community who you would expect to actually do the kind of research where it is so obvious? I mean, finding without any proper control, all those individuals say that it's not in this yet you're not seeing it.
Right. So the people who have expertise and resources to do these kind of studies are also associated with the nuclear establishment. So, a lot of studies done by like Bhabha Atomic Research Center or other such centers also are under Department of Atomic Energy. There does not exist much expertise outside of that in India, at least. And what independent studies we have, like there were some other studies done by a Japanese scientist. They don't have as much resources. So for example, to do the kind of epidemiological studies that would be needed to give any sort of conclusive evidence, it's very hard to have those kind of resources. And the people there, the community there has been trying to actually get someone to do it, but it's difficult. Any other questions? Yeah. Right. Yeah.
Why is there less?
So in the 2000s, in the late 2000s, there was a court case that happened in Jharkhand. So the state court took cognizance of this controversy, looking at the media reports. And what happened was they eventually ended up admitting evidence from the nuclear establishment itself and saying that there is no evidence to say that any health impacts are happening from the mines. So the burden of proof has again come to lie on the communities to show that there might be some impacts. Is that, yeah. Could you be a little louder? I'm unable to hear. She's saying if it was renewables or coal mining or something like that. Well, I definitely think that renewables are less risky than nuclear, less expensive also, and easier to scale. But there you see in India that there are even conflicts because of large solar parks like coming up, and communities are again being displaced to build them up. So I don't have a like clear answer to that. I just think that only switching technologies is not the solution. We need other political solutions to deal with climate change. Thank you. Okay. Sorry? Kai, you can unmute yourself.
Oh, great. Thank you, Prana. I really appreciated this talk. It was really super interesting. I wish I could hear the questions properly. My question is about the studies that were done, which I loved the flow diagram that you had that revealed how various people exited the study or were not included in the study. I couldn't hear all of what you said there, but it sounded like in the end, the resulting tests had abominably low levels of power, right? Really low sample sizes. If anybody did a power analysis on that, I can't imagine that they would have concluded it was sufficient. And so I just wonder, you know, this is well outside of my area of expertise, but I wonder whether there are any standards for, you know, the minimum sample sizes or levels of power in studies that are considered for these purposes as demonstrating a lack of risk. I mean, it just like, it's appalling that that passed muster in those ways. So I wonder if you could comment on that. I don't know if you know beyond the Indian case or just in the Indian case, but any of the above, I'd love to hear your thoughts on it.
So this is a very difficult area of study, and it's beyond my understanding. But from what I understand, that there were a lot of epidemiological studies done in US as well, in the Navajo mining, in the Navajo Nation where uranium mining happened. And the results from that were seen as sufficient to say that the mines were impacting people's health and causing lung cancer, especially in the workers. But from what I understand, from the little understanding I have of this complex area, is that it is a very contentious issue. And to be able to, again, as with any kind of cancer, like it's very hard to say what are the real causes, and basically trying to isolate the causes is very hard. So yeah, epidemiological studies are the standards, is what I understand.
Yeah, to clarify, my question isn't about whether they're the standard, but whether there are standards about minimum sample sizes or minimum power given the sample size in order for, you know, for an industry to represent a finding as suggesting that there is no impact, as opposed to just, you know, the study was insufficient in order to demonstrate anything at all.
So I don't know, I don't think there are any standards in India, but I'm not sure if there are, but it's a good question. I'll look into it. Yeah.
Thank you so much. If you find anything, I'd be keen to hear it.
Okay, thank you.
I'm so sorry for all of you online. I think you missed the beginning of my introduction of Emma. I'm not going to, I won't repeat that, but I will turn it over to Emma now. I will make a plug also. Emma, one of her additional talents is being a talented violist and will be performing as part of her trio in today's talent show. So you should see that as well.
Thanks, Amanda. Okay, I'm gonna figure out how to put this on first. Can everyone hear me on Zoom?
Erna, we can hear you, but when there is questions from the audience, it would be grateful if you could repeat it for the Zoom audience.
Okay, I'll do that.
Thank
Thanks,
you.
Abby. Yeah, okay. All right, thanks, Amanda, for the introduction. Yeah, my name's Emma. I'm a master's student here at IRES. And today I'll be presenting some work from my master's thesis in which I'm trying to understand how environmental change has been affecting mercury in the Beaufort Sea, which is in the Arctic. Oh no, these work. Let me just, okay. So here's a brief outline of my presentation. I'll first give you some background and then dive into the methods. I'm using a few different methods here, so I'm not going to go into real depth on a lot of them, but if you have any questions, feel free to ask me after. And then I'll go into the results. There are some preliminary results which I'll flag, and then finally the conclusions. Okay, so just to situate you a bit here, this is the study location. It's the Beaufort Sea, the part of the Beaufort Sea in the Western Canadian Arctic. So it's part of the Arctic Ocean. And my study site in particular is located in the Inuvialuit settlement region, or ISR. It's also called the Inuvialuit Nunangat. It's one of the 4 Inuit regions of Canada, specifically home to the Inuvialuit people. And I'm particularly interested in the part of the Beaufort Sea that is near land called the Beaufort Sea Shelf, or the BSS. So that's in the figure on the right there, zoomed in a bit on the ISR. You can see the shelf region. I also just want to take a moment here to acknowledge that it really is a privilege for me to do research in this area. I'm not from the region. I did have the opportunity to visit in March to attend a meeting of the Inuvialuit Game Council, and just very grateful to the council and the community for giving so much time and feedback and for being very welcoming. So I'm interested in the food web in this region. You can see there's a lot of different species in the food web. There's beluga whales and polar bears all the way at the top. There's ringed seals, a lot of different fish species like Arctic char and Arctic cod. There are tiny little animals floating around, zooplankton. And then there are also benthic species. These are species that live on the sea floor like clams. And then down at the bottom of the food web are primary producers. So there's a picture of ice algae. And these guys grow on the bottom or the underside of sea ice. So very much interested in the food web as a whole, but also have a particular focus on the Beaufort Sea beluga. So this is a stock of beluga whale found in the Beaufort Sea. And one reason that they're of particular interest is they are culturally and ecologically very important to Inuvialuit communities. There's also been this very long-standing beluga biomonitoring program in the region, so we have a lot of information on them. This is a collaborative effort between the Fisheries Joint Management Committee in the region, DFO, and then ISR communities who are doing traditional harvesting of beluga. And this program produces data not only on contaminants like you see in this figure, it's mercury trends over time in beluga, but also on other biological aspects of beluga like body condition and species distribution. And so I'm interested in particular in mercury. Mercury is a naturally occurring element in the Earth's crust, but human activity has greatly influenced its concentrations in the environment. And I'm sure many of you know that there's a lot of health impacts affiliated with mercury, in particular methylmercury, which is the kind that can be produced in aquatic systems, is a neurotoxicant. So it can affect brain function and motor skills in mammals. And it's also bioaccumulative. So it can build up in organisms and then it can biomagnify up the food chain. So you can get very high concentrations of it in apex predators like beluga and also humans. In the ISR, communities have also cited mercury as a concern in terms of ecosystem health, but also in terms of potentially impacting the benefit that they get from traditional harvesting of species like beluga and ringed seal. And then finally, concentrations of mercury in organisms in the region have been changing a bit over time, and it's thought that these could be affected by environmental changes. So if you look at this diagram here, You can see the mercury cycle is quite complex. It's quite linked to things in the environment. You have inorganic mercury that's floating around in the air. It can be emitted from wildfires. It can flow into the ocean via river runoff and erosion. It can even be sitting in sea ice. And then once it's in the ocean itself, it can be converted into methylmercury, which is the bioaccumulative form. So this is the species of mercury that I'm very interested in looking at, just because it can bioaccumulate and enter the food web. Okay, so with all that being said, my research objective is to identify and assess the influence of environmental drivers on historic methylmercury bioaccumulation in the Beaufort Sea. And I have a few questions associated with this. The first one is, what have been the most important environmental changes in the Beaufort Sea over the past 50 years? So a historical perspective. The second one is, how have these changes affected methylmercury trends in the food web? And then stemming from this, where could we improve our knowledge of the ecosystem and of mercury cycling, since these two things are associated with quite high uncertainty? Okay, so I'm going to go over some methods. So essentially just like a synopsis of my project, it entails looking at the most important environmental changes over the past 50 years, and then implementing some of these into an ecosystem model to see how they might have potentially affected methylmercury trends in the food web. So this first portion here is the identification of the environmental drivers. So that consists of a few different things. Firstly, I've done a review of Western science literature and Inuvialuit knowledge literature on environmental change in mercury. Then I've done validation of these literature reviews with both Western scientists and a future workshop with Inuvialuit knowledge holders. So a note on that is I'm in the process of working with each Hunters and Trappers Committee from the ISL now to decide what can be shared publicly. So I won't be sharing any results from the IK section today. I'll just be focusing on the Western science section, but there will be a region-wide workshop that will be to come to validate my understanding of the IK Lit review. And then finally, the last step here is fuzzy cognitive mapping. It's essentially a type of systems mapping to help visualize and analyze all the information I've gained from the literature reviews and the validation. So I mentioned fuzzy cognitive maps, FCMs. These are important here because they're what I'm going to be using to pass through all the information, all the interactions in the system, see which are potentially the most important, which might be driving mercury. So the figure you see here is an example of an FCM applied to social determinants of diabetes, and FCMs have rarely been applied to environmental sciences actually, so it's a fairly new method in this field. But basically they're a type of systems map. They were originally introduced by Bart Kosko in 1986, and they can be used for modeling complex relationships, accounting for uncertainty, and drawing upon information from different knowledge sources. Part of the reason they can do all of this is that they're semi-quantitative. So you can use more qualitative observations or methods like interviews, and then apply them in a more quantitative way. And what allows you to do this is you see in the systems diagram or the FCM, there are all these numbers on the linkages. So it allows you to basically give a weight to reflect the importance of each interaction in the system. And this makes it possible to apply graph theory, basically linear algebra, to examine interactions and better understand the system. And then I'm going to be using two methods in particular, graph theoretic analysis and full probability closure analysis, to analyze these. So if you have any questions on that, feel free to ask me after. Okay, so I just went over the first phase of identifying the environmental drivers. That's a standalone piece, but it's also aimed to inform the second part, which is the ecosystem modeling. And this consists of taking, the most important environmental changes from that first part, developing these into scenarios which I can put into the ecosystem model, and then running them in an ecosystem model called EcoPath with EcoSym. And just to reiterate here that the purpose of the ecosystem modeling is to get an idea of the methylmercury trends rather than the concentrations, or not trying to predict health risks or anything here. So the ecosystem model is, as I mentioned, EcoPath with EcoSym. It's an aquatic food web model that consists of a few different tools. So we have EcoPath, which is just the base food web model. It represents the food web at a single point in time. EcoSym takes EcoPath at different points in time and kind of weaves them together to give us an idea of how the ecosystem is changing over time. And then EcoTracer focuses on how contaminants are moving on in the food web. So this is the portion I'll be focusing on because I'll be looking at methyl mercury. Just to note that the EcoPath with EcoSym portions of the model for the Beaufort Sea have been parameterized by Carrie Hoover with DFO. And then we came in and recently parameterized the EcoTracer portion. And this work was led by Dr. Mi-Ling Lee at the University of Delaware, but formerly a postdoc in Amanda's lab here at IRES. So this work is submitted and currently under review. Okay, I'll get into results now. So firstly, I just wanted to show you an example of a fuzzy cognitive map that I created based on an interview with a scientist. So we went through different variables in the system and their interactions, what weights the scientist would give each link. This map you see here is a product of me running the graph theoretic analysis, which basically it calculates what we call the centrality of each variable or node in the system. And what that means is it accounts for the number of links going into and out of each variable, as well as the weight of those links. So if you look at this diagram, the bigger nodes or variables are the ones that are more central or connected to other things in the system. Things like CI store are very central. It can also tell us if something is more of a transmitter or a receiver. A transmitter is more of a driver of change in the system, so it has more arrows going out of the variable. And these would be things that are colored more in red. So something like temperature or CI store or freshwater discharge. And then on the other hand, it can tell us if a variable is more of a receiver or more susceptible to changes in the system. It has more arrows going into it than out of it. These are more blue, so things like methylation, total mercury inputs. So that's the kind of thing that this analysis can tell us. And then just to note that I had 7 of these to analyze in all, 6 from the Western science side, so 1 for each interview I did with scientists, and then just 1 based on the IK Lit review. That one is based only on my understanding of the literature so far, but that will probably change moving forward when we have this workshop. And again, just to remind you, I won't be sharing that until I have permission. Okay, so when I brought together all the results from the FCMs, as you can imagine, there were a lot of environmental changes going on. I listed the most important ones here, and how I got the most important ones was I took the changes with the highest out degree, basically the transmitters or the drivers of change in the system, and grouped them together in this table you see here. You can see a lot of the changes are perhaps unsurprisingly linked to climate change. We have sea ice melt and increasing temperature, permafrost melt. And then in these FCMs, the changes were found to broadly affect methyl mercury bioaccumulation via 3 main mechanisms. So the first one was via changes to the food web. So some of these changes can affect primary production, for example, which can actually biodilute mercury concentrations. It can make it lower in the food web. Environmental changes can also affect methylation. That's a process that converts inorganic mercury to methyl mercury, which is the kind that bioaccumulates. And then they can also sometimes affect the mercury inputs themselves into the system. So in the case of, say, permafrost melt, that can cause more inputs of sediments into the river and the ocean, which can increase mercury inputs. Now I wanted to show you the other analysis I did on the FCMs. So here's an FCM I made with a scientist. Another very useful thing associated with these maps is that we can uncover indirect drivers of change. So drivers that were not directly linked on the original FCMs, but are indirectly linked. So when I run this analysis in the FCM software, please don't be scared. This is what it does. It can calculate all of these indirect links, sort of like surprising or often hidden relationships. So in the case of things driving methylation over here, this analysis surfaced these indirect drivers highlighted here in yellow. So not super important to go over those now because that was a messy map, but this is the kind of thing that it can tell us. So one example, as I was mentioning from the Western Science FCMs, was with methylation. So for example, one thing we can get from this is that increasing nutrient inputs and permafrost melt will drive up methylation. So that would increase methyl mercury concentrations. While something like turbidity, that's the cloudiness or the murkiness of the water basically, if that goes up, then that will decrease methylation. And this is via like indirect linkages, essentially. I think it's important just in terms of like using the case of methylation, very uncertain in the literature. You know, scientists often discuss hypotheses of things that might be driving methylation, but they often have very little idea of what direction it would, if it would increase methylation or decrease it. So this kind of analysis can kind of generate new hypotheses about that. Okay, so moving on from the environmental changes identification section and then into the ecosystem modeling portion. Yeah, I wanted to use some of the insights I'd gotten from the FCMs and apply those to the ecosystem model. So using this final list of the most important environmental changes, I narrowed them down further, and this was mainly based on available data. So in the end, I selected sea ice, winds, freshwater discharge, and water temperature as candidates for environmental change scenarios. And these I will have time series data on from 1970 to 2013. So I'm going to take you through some scenarios I've implemented using the freshwater discharge time series. So I had this time series of freshwater discharge from the Mackenzie River. The Mackenzie is a very large river system. It's the second largest watershed in North America after the Mississippi. And basically the freshwater discharge is how much of the fresh water is entering the Beaufort Sea model system every month of every year. There's been a slight increasing trend from 1970 to 2013. It actually decreased up until 1990, and then it increased again. But basically, I'm taking this data and I'm inputting it into the ecosystem model in the form of a few different scenarios. So the first one is I'm using freshwater discharge to force methylmercury inputs. The assumption here is that as freshwater discharge goes up, it brings a lot more sediments. You can see from that picture, it gives a lot of sediments to the Beaufort Sea. And that will increase mercury concentrations. The second scenario is freshwater discharge forcing primary production. The assumption here is if freshwater discharge increases, nutrients will increase, and that will force primary production higher. And then the third one is a combination. So seeing what happens when I use freshwater discharge to force both methylmercury and primary production. Okay, so these results are preliminary, but I just wanted to show you what would happen if we look at the beluga methylmercury concentrations under the different freshwater discharge scenarios. So this base case here on the graph in purple, we're comparing everything to this base case. One note that it's slightly increasing, the concentrations are slightly increasing. That's because there's a parameter in the food web model in which there's subsistence hunting of beluga. So the biomass over time is ever so slightly going down, which forces mercury concentrations a bit higher. But this is present in all of the scenarios, just to explain why that's going up there. When we look at scenario one, the one that's forcing methylmercury, in relation to the base case, we see that at first this leads to a decrease in mercury levels. That's because freshwater discharge decreased from 1970 to 1990. But when freshwater discharge increased again, mercury levels rise. Scenario two, the one that's forcing production, had an opposite effect. So you can see this initial rise, that's because freshwater inputs have decreased. So it's less nutrients to promote primary production, biomass of primary producers declines, leading to mercury being more concentrated. And that goes up the food chain all the way to beluga. And then we see a decline of mercury levels when freshwater discharge increases again. So scenarios 1 and 2 are essentially diverging. When I combine them, we see that an initial increase in mercury levels, largely due to scenario 2, then subsequently a decrease in mercury, and a final increase driven more by scenario 1. Okay, so moving on to conclusions. So we've shown that changes related to climate have been most important and likely have affected mercury. This has important implications for how climate change might play out in the future. Thus far, freshwater discharge from the Mackenzie River seems to affect methylmercury in the model system through a few different mechanisms. And then I think this shows that there's value in using a systems level and mixed methods approach to understanding contaminant cycling and climate change. So for instance, ecosystem modeling can help us visualize how changes with diverging effects can play out, can give us a better understanding of the system. FCMs can highlight indirect drivers of certain processes, generate new hypotheses, and perhaps inform monitoring decisions. And then drawing upon different knowledge systems not only gives us better understanding of the system, but it can also, just make space for different ways of knowing that have historically been ignored in environmental research. I do believe that this should be done respectfully. The process itself is extremely important. I hope that this kind of illustrates that. While I can't show you all the environmental changes from the Inuvialuit knowledge literature, the engagement process, I hope it shows that the engagement process doesn't always happen on the scale of a master's thesis, and it shouldn't be forced to do that either. But hopefully I will be able to share results from that soon. Okay, so for future work, I'll be continuing communication with ISR communities, validating my understanding of the IK literature with them via a workshop. Another step is running more scenarios in EWE and examining the results a bit more closely. And then further down the line, the plan would be to potentially test future scenarios of environmental change in the region rather than just historical, which is what I focused on. I'd like to acknowledge all of my collaborators, particularly, of course, my supervisor, Amanda, and committee members, Meiling Lee and Billy Christensen. I also would like to thank everyone in my lab at IRES, as well as the Inuvialuit Game Council, and then finally grateful for funding received from the following sources. So thank you, everyone. Yes, Nigel. Okay. You can go first. Yeah. So Nigel was asking, how did I get from the interviews with scientists to those fuzzy cognitive maps that I showed you? Yeah, basically, so I had an interview with each scientist, and it was always on Zoom, and I would share my screen, and I have a touch laptop, basically, so I could use a pen to just draw an extremely messy FCM with them. So I'd go through and ask them, what kind of variables do you think are the most important in the system in terms of environmental changes? And they might say something like, oh, I think storms have been increasing, or, there's been a lot of permafrost melt. And so I just write down like random variables. And then I'd ask, how do you think this has affected mercury? And I would have certain, if they didn't say certain variables that I'd gotten. So for example, I wanted to talk about like bioenergetics, or like mercury being directly absorbed by producers. And if they didn't talk about that, then I would ask them a question on it. So that was like informed by my literature review. But yeah, and then I would send them the finished result that was more cleaned up than what I was drawing during the interview. Sometimes they got very overwhelmed by what I was drawing because it was very messy. But yeah, and then they would edit it if they needed, and that's how I got the end result. Yeah. Thank you. We'll go to Steve first. And
I think so are the values then at there's like I think so, I saw 0.7. Yeah, so I guess my question are the values determined, and then the second what's the layout algorithm that you're using? Is that just sort of like, is there, I said there's a software, so I was curious because there's different, graph theory layout algorithms, and I know that highlight hierarchical layout.
yeah. Okay, so Steve was asking, first question is basically what are the weights mean essentially in the FCM. So for my project, how I did it was a weight between -1 and 1. So 0 is there's no arrow, there's no link because there's no relationship. Negative, and it's based on the comparative strength, and that's just based on what scientists thought. So I would say, do you think that we'll just take the positive side of these things? So 0 to 1. 1 would be the strongest relationship possible. So that was very infrequent that they would be like so so confident in a relationship that they would say this is definitely the strongest relationship. Most of the time is like a moderate strength. That would be 0.5. Sometimes it was weak. And what ended up happening was scientists were not very willing to put a weight on things. I thought they would be, but it ended up being most of them were around 0.5. And then often ones that were like they were very uncertain about, and they were like, I'm not even sure if this is a relationship. I would say, okay, well, let's put a 0.25 on it. So yeah, very messy, as you can see, but that's kind of yeah, these maps are messy. And then your second question, which was about which software am I using? I'm using a software called Scientisimi, which is basically like, yeah, it does a lot of it for you. So that was very helpful to me because I'm not very good at linear algebra. Yeah, you can look it up and contact the person. Scientisimi, I can send it to you after. Yeah, yeah. Thank you. Melinda, yeah. Mm. Mm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. So Melinda's asking how exactly these numbers, I guess, are like affect the calculations. I'll go to my extra slide. Oh God, there's too many. This one. This might be a good slide to show, just in that this doesn't have arrows, so it's not a digraph, so it doesn't have the directed connections, but it is a graph still, so it has the links. It also doesn't have different, it just has ones and zeros, but if you can imagine, mine would be like, some of the connections would be a 0.5 or a 0.25, and then when you add them up, this is calculating the centrality, you would end up with like a lower number if there's some lower numbers in there. Does that make sense? Yeah. Okay. Yes. Yeah. So it's just some nice matrices. Yeah. Yeah. Steve. Sure. I don't make the rules.
So I'm just curious about this made me think. So does it also measure other types of centrality? So there are like all these different types of centrality. Like you talked about, there's like transmitter receivers, but it's like a centrality, which is sort of like looking at the like kind of, is there a node that is connected with different clusters in the network? I'm curious if like, does the software do that, or just like look at that?
Yeah, so Steve is asking, is it just one type of centrality that it's measuring, or that others? I think I was focusing more on the degree centrality. I think from what I remember, it was only degree centrality, but there were a lot of other, there were some other like algorithms that I didn't really look into. It is entirely plausible that there are other ones, but I did not use them. Yeah. Mm-hmm. There were interesting ones in like, they were, God, I can't remember the name of the analysis, but it was like, you can see how a change in one thing, you press on like the variable and you can see how that ripples through the system. Yeah, might be good to look into. Thank you. Yes. Okay, one more question. Yeah, so the question was, were there any drivers that came out of this analysis that surprised me? I would say, I feel like I was expecting a lot of them, like climate change. There were some that I expected to be drivers that were not as important. Like I thought the oil and gas exploration, there's been oil and gas exploration in the region, and I thought that would have come out more in the not only the Western science section, but the IK section. Things like acidification and shifts in prey have been cited a lot in the literature, but when I was actually talking to scientists, these were more of a concern moving forward into the future. They've definitely been seen, like acidification has been happening, but it was more of a concern for the future. So stuff like that I would have expected. That surprised me. Yeah. Thank you. Okay. Sounds good. Nice. Thank you. I don't know how to use this microphone.
Fine. It's my great pleasure to introduce the final speaker of today, Brinley Hanson-Wright. There's a Chinese proverb that says, the kind love the water, the wise love the mountain. Brinley spends an enormous amount of time in the water and the mountain by kayaking, canoeing, skiing, cycling. So you can tell how wise and kind she is. She's kind enough to be the co-president of the IRES Student Society for the last 2 years. So thank you for your last year. So thank you, Brinley, for your service. And she is wise enough to choose the carbon calculator as her master thesis topic. This is really important work that fills a knowledge gap in the public mind of how large our carbon footprints are. It also offers a very effective behavioral tool to unleash the climate action in the general public. And Brinley just defended her master thesis last month, and she's in the process of writing up the manuscript for publication. So if you can offer your feedback, suggestions, comments to her today, that would be really appreciated. So thank you so much for being here, and over to Brinley.
Can everybody on Zoom hear me? Okay, thumbs up are good. Well, thank you, Jiaying, for introducing me and for also pretty much summarizing exactly what I'm going to talk about today. There's not much need for me to spend the next 20 minutes on it because that was a solid summary, but Jiaying is right. I'll be talking about one of the studies that was part of my thesis on carbon calculators. So anthropogenic climate change associated with increased levels of greenhouse gas emissions will have widespread impacts on human life and ecosystems around the world. And globally, about 70% of these emissions are attributed to household consumption, primarily from food, mobility, and shelter. Shifting individual behaviors offers high emission reduction potential, and as such, demand-side mitigation measures are recognized as an essential course of action by both researchers and organizations like the IPCC. So how can we bring about this necessary behavior change to address the climate crisis? I'll go through the background, research design, and analyses from my one study on carbon calculators to help answer this question. So to begin with, the greenhouse gas impacts of daily actions are very challenging for people to conceptualize. This has been well documented within single domains, for example, comparing the emissions of different foods, as well as some work across domains. So as one example, people often underestimate the impact of flying and red meat consumption while overestimating the impact of doing things like recycling and using reusable bags. And this presents a barrier to climate-friendly action. If people are doing these very easy actions, they may think they're already doing their part and perceive themselves as eco-friendly without realizing how minimal their efforts are. Researchers have come up with the terms of carbon literacy, carbon numeracy, and carbon capability to define and measure this concept. and research within this umbrella consistently finds that carbon footprints are intangible byproducts of our lifestyles, and most people have a hard time understanding these emissions. We really don't think about carbon emissions much in our daily lives, especially if we're not in a program like IRES. We don't look at these kinds of price tags in terms of carbon on the actions or the items that we buy. It's not something that we think about at the end of the year in the way that we do with taxes. And it's really not even that well covered in education systems, with the high impact actions rarely being covered within our textbooks and our curricula. One of the options to try to counter this is to make carbon emissions more salient. And in my thesis, I looked at both using carbon labels to do this, and then what I'll be talking about today, using a carbon calculator, which presents people with their total emissions, and they can see kind of which domains are having the biggest contribution to their footprint. So these carbon calculators are quite a popular tool online, and their goal is mainly to raise awareness about personal greenhouse gas emissions. So in these tools, users will input various different pieces of information about their lifestyle, and the calculator then provides estimates of their emissions. And despite being prolific on the internet for up to the past 20 years, very little is known about how they impact behavior. So a recent literature review about using carbon calculators for behavior change identified many shortcomings in the few existing studies. Previous research has used small sample sizes, convenient samples of students, as well as people with pre-existing interest in the topic, has lacked control groups, failed to identify the importance of different features, such as tailored feedback, and did not include any civic actions as outcomes. So these were some of the limitations I tried to address in this study. So overall, this study was a randomized 2-group experiment on the efficacy of a carbon calculator. Reported behaviors in 2019 and behavioral intentions for 2023 were used to quantify an intended change in carbon footprint, and I compared how this intended change differed between 2 groups. So in terms of my hypothesis, I predicted that people who were presented with this personalized carbon footprint feedback would have a different intended change in footprint than those who were in a control group. As for the direction, I predicted that if people in the control group were intending to increase their emissions in the future, those in the control group would be, or those in the feedback group would be increasing by less. And if everybody was decreasing, they'd be decreasing by more. So just in general, going in a more positive environmental direction. I was also curious whether this calculator intervention that was targeting private actions would spill over to system changing things such as voting or carbon offsetting. And the literature currently shows mixed effects for spillover. So there's evidence that it can lead to backfire in other domains, or that it can kind of increase a sense of identity and lead to more pro-environmental actions. And this was really important to look at because we don't want something that will increase private actions while undermining something like policy support. I also wanted to understand if an affective response of eco-guilt mediated changes in behavioral intentions. And there are numerous studies indicating that carbon feedback can induce eco-guilt, and also other studies showing correlations between these emotional states and climate action, but the causal pathway is not very well understood. Lastly, I wanted to know whether people who learn about their own footprint have a different perception of which people or which groups are responsible for mitigating climate change. So this is what the survey flow looked like in the control group. People first input information about their behaviors in 2019, then their intentions for 2023, and then some exploratory variables and covariates. So the first part was used for calculating a footprint. The second part, again, for a future footprint. There were 5 different exploratory variables that I'll discuss some of today. And then the covariates were mostly demographic and climate concern variables. In the feedback group, the flow was identical. The only addition was the carbon calculator feedback. And this included 3 components that I'll explain on some of the subsequent slides. And after receiving this information, participants also answered a few questions about their understanding of that content. I designed the carbon calculator to encompass these 4 main domains of consumption. So looking at home energy, food, transportation, and material purchases. And the same data sources and the same questions were used for both 2019 and 2023. And this calculator also included some geographically relevant data for things like the price of gas and diesel, the grid carbon intensity, as well as the amount of energy that homes in different regions would use. So I'll walk through one example. Here would be a question for food. So it asks, how many servings of these foods did you eat per week? If you didn't eat some of them, you can put 0. And we asked about things like red meat, other meat, milk, cheese, chocolate, and coffee, with a description of what one serving would entail, and participants would put in a number. And just to show how that was then calculated, I had the serving sizes, the emissions per serving size. A participant would then enter how many servings they would eat per week. We would multiply that with the number of weeks in the year for a total number. And then by doing that for each of the different categories, we would have a total footprint for food. And the same thing was done for all of the other consumption domains as well. In terms of the calculator feedback, there were 3 major components, and the participants who were in the feedback condition received all 3 of these components. So first was a total footprint and a breakdown by domain. So participants would see a paragraph explaining what this meant, a graph showing them the different contributions to their footprint, and then an exact estimate of what that footprint was. Next, I provided some information about the need to reduce, the American pledge to reduce by 50%, and then gave participants a target that was 50% lower than whatever they had in 2019. Lastly, each participant received 2 tailored recommendations. So these were based on whatever their highest domains were, which is important to note because they weren't randomized in an experimental way, but given to participants so that they could make the highest impact changes possible. And this is just one example where if you reduce replace half the servings of meat and dairy with other protein options, it would save this certain amount of emissions. So this study was pre-registered on the Open Science Framework in January. And basically what this means is that I had to commit in advance to the different hypotheses and analyses and sample size that I was planning to use. And the purpose of doing something like this is just to avoid or minimize publication bias and p-hacking, in which researchers tend to report on the most interesting and most significant findings from their results. And what I go over today in the presentation includes both some of that pre-registered as well as some exploratory analyses. In terms of my sample size, there was a target minimum of 676 participants, and I calculated this with a power analysis to determine how many participants I would need to detect a relatively small effect with 90% power and 5% alpha error probability. And the purpose of this is just to make sure that if a true effect did exist, I would be likely to document it. These are the different pre-registered exclusion criteria. So participants were excluded if they had participated in a pilot study of this calculator, if they failed to complete the whole survey, if they were incorrect on any attention check questions, if someone from the same IP address had done the same study, if they restarted midway through, or if it was completed in a very short or very long period of time for the survey. And lastly, to avoid the influence of outliers, the bottom 5% and top 5% in terms of carbon footprint were also excluded from the analysis. So this data collection took place over the winter on Amazon Mechanical Turk. MTurk is a platform online where workers can sign up and do different tasks that are typically quite short and for small payments. So in this case, we offered $1, which was conditional upon passing those attention checks. And all of the following analyses were conducted in R. So this sample was 52% female identifying. They were predominantly white, and the average household income was 50 to 60,000. These next 3 things differed quite substantially from the American population in general, such that this sample was more liberal, more educated, as well as a bit more concerned about climate change. However, other than the completion time, there were no significant differences between the control group and the calculator group. So that is not an explanation of the results. So this slide shows the overall carbon footprints. On the top is 2019 and the bottom is 2023. And this is across the whole sample, so including both groups. The means were 11.2 tons and 10.5 tons. And in each year, transportation was the largest domain, followed by housing and then food. Now, this slide again shows histograms in the full sample, but we're looking at a change from the 2019 measure to the 2023 measure. On the top is the pre-registered change, which was absolute. So anything positive here is the number of tons somebody would intend to increase in the future. Whereas on the bottom, this was just a sensitivity analysis, but looking at it in terms of a percentage change from baseline. So again, positive numbers here are the percentage that they intend to increase from 2019 to 2023. And this figure now depicts the group differences. So the left panel is the control group, the right panel is feedback. Within each, there's the 2019 on the left and 2023 on the right. And the height of the bars are the emissions, and the colors represent the various different domains. So in the control group, there was an intended increase of 0.05 tons. In the feedback group, it was an intended decrease of 1.42 tons. And the difference between these groups in intended footprint change was a statistically reliable small effect size. Due to strong non-normality, I conducted both an independent sample t-test as well as a Mann-Whitney U. However, both analyses showed the same thing, which was a small, statistically significant difference in intended footprint change between the groups. And this suggests that compared to the control group, the feedback led to lower carbon intentions for 2023 relative to 2019. I then repeated this analysis 10 additional times with various other restrictions on the sample or different ways of calculating the footprint. And the same findings were replicated each time. They were all statistically significant, and the effect sizes were all in that same range of a small effect. Now, I don't expect you to look at all the numbers. These are just showing the various different analyses, and I want to highlight two of them that were particularly interesting. This shows that people who had an above average and a below average footprint to begin with had the effect replicated, so it was effective in both groups, as well as in liberals and conservatives, it was effective, showing that this carbon information can lead to the intended results for a wide range of participants. And these circles just indicate any of the sensitivity analyses that showed a larger effect size than the main pre-registered analysis. Next, I'll go over a few of the exploratory analyses, but definitely not all of them. The first one is looking at footprint changes by domain. So when looking at footprint changes within each of those domains, there were significant group differences in food, transportation, clothing, and technology, such that participants who received feedback intended to lower their emissions more than the control group within each of these domains, as predicted and in a promising way that this is applying across many domains. This carbon offset measure gave participants the opportunity to donate some of their bonus money towards carbon offsets if they desired. However, there were no significant differences between the groups in the quantity donated, suggesting that the footprint feedback did not spill over to this behavior. Civic intentions included things like an intention to vote, donate, or volunteer your time with environmentally related objectives. And there were marginal differences in intentions here, such that people who received the feedback were slightly less inclined to do these different actions. This wasn't significant, but it was something that we wanted to look into further because of that concern that there might be kind of political backlash from using a calculator. As for eco-guilt, this measured things like how guilty people feel about contributing to global warming, and there were no differences between conditions here, which suggests that receiving the feedback did not elicit this response, and that this kind of affective response is not what's driving the change in behavior. And in terms of mitigation responsibility, there were also no differences between groups here. So regardless of whether somebody received information about their own footprint or not, it didn't change the extent to which they felt that individuals versus corporations or the government was responsible for dealing with climate change. And the last exploratory result I'll share on the next slide is my coding of a thematic analysis where participants gave their initial thoughts and comments when they saw their own footprint and the target for them to reduce. So I coded each response into up to 4 categories. And you can see that the top one was the most frequent, is claiming that this would be a hard or impossible target to reduce by 50%. But the ones following that are slightly more encouraging. The next 3 were a personal reduction goal, stating something along the lines of that reduction is important without their own goal, and a personal reduction action, which was anything more specific, like I plan to reduce my red meat consumption. To summarize, this study showed that the carbon calculator feedback shifted intended carbon footprints towards lower impacts lifestyles as hypothesized. The effect of the carbon calculator was small but significant, with the feedback group shifting down 1.48 tons, which was about 13% from 2019 to 2023 relative to the control condition. The intervention had no measurable effect on eco-guilt, carbon offsetting, civic intentions, or attribution of climate mitigation responsibility. And based on qualitative responses, there was also a wide range in reactions to the carbon footprint information, from some people feeling very grateful to learn about this information, to others being enraged that they were blamed for these emissions. And there were 4 main limitations that I'd like to bring up about this study. The first is that I utilized intentions and self-reports of behavior, and neither of these map directly onto objective behavior. However, given the scope of the relevant actions that a carbon calculator is used for across the whole lifestyle and my time frame, this was the most realistic design for the moment. The design of the intervention also had some flaws for what we're able to interpret. So because I used multiple different feedback components all combined, we can't tease apart whether it was the recommendations or the target that was leading to the desired changes, and that'll have to be looked at in future work to figure out what's most important. And also the visual design of the calculator outputs was very basic relative to some of the fancier and more visually appealing interfaces that people would come across online. COVID was also a bit of a nuisance, as in many people's research, where I didn't want to capture pandemic lifestyles, so was asking participants to reflect on a time before COVID and a hypothetical future beyond COVID, which means that there may have been poor recall of what people were doing back then, as well as a bit of uncertainty about what they plan to be doing that far in the future. And there are also many other changes that can occur over that time frame that are not due to this intervention. And lastly, along COVID, it's unclear when we were measuring intentions for 2023, whether this was a short-term reaction to COVID, like a rebound to having been under all these types of quarantines, or whether these did reflect longer, more stable intentions for the future. And the last limitation is just by using an mTurk sample. It is widely used in psychological research. However, I do want to acknowledge that there are concerns about inattention and duplicate responses that I've done my best to screen out, and that the sample is not fully representative of the general public, though it is more diverse than a lot of the undergraduate samples used in a lot of psychological research. Future studies should aim to repeat some of these measures a second time to understand the longevity of the effect, and should also aim to delineate the necessary feedback features. Researchers should also aim to test a more technologically advanced calculator and consider embedding possible policies to see how participants intend to react under different scenarios. I know there's some research beginning on this where you can ask participants what they would do in the future if there were different charges on parking, or if there was different subsidies on transit and things like that. So it'd be an interesting way to see how people plan to react under different possible future directions. It would also be worth adding other measures into the study, for example, a more direct measure of people's knowledge after doing the calculator, because even if they don't want to change their behavior, they may still be learning from the process of going through it. And there are also other affective measures that could be added here as well. And lastly, this study could be replicated with other groups. I think it would be particularly interesting in some unique demographics like youth, who are about to embark on many life changes and might be more able to make some of these changes in their lifestyle, as well as sustainability experts who know a lot about sustainability, but may still be quite unaware of their own personal footprint, and just to see how this translates into that kind of an audience. So overall, in this study, I explored whether greenhouse gas knowledge is a significant barrier to pro-climate behavior, and whether this deficiency can be aided by making emissions more salient. Empirical testing of this carbon calculator suggested the effect sizes are small, but significant, and that when provided with the necessary information, individuals are interested in shifting towards more sustainable lifestyles. I believe that this tool warrants implementation, for example, within education, within various government tools, or within broader schemes like personal carbon allowances. However, further analyses are required to optimize the designs for both the best learning and best behavior change outcomes. I do not believe that carbon calculators are presenting an answer for climate change, but the desire for a perfect solution should not prevent progress on initiatives that can realistically reduce emissions and complement larger future measures as they arise. Carbon calculators can empower individuals in the immediate future to reduce their emissions and help reach global sustainability goals. And having covered this content, I would like to thank all of the following people for making this possible. Specifically, Jiaying and Hadi, you have both provided tremendous support, guidance, and feedback throughout this project, for which I am incredibly grateful. You coded the carbon calculator on a website, which I also greatly appreciated. And lastly, thanks both to the lab and all my peers here who have given me feedback and suggestions and moral support the whole way throughout this degree. So thanks, everyone. Nigel? Yeah, Nigel's question was about the extent to which these kind of personal individual behavior interventions could lead to wider systemic change through companies by how individuals can exert their kind of collective power on those different institutions. Yes. I would say that a carbon calculator can encourage people to act in a different way. And specifically with things like food purchasing, that demand can then shift the types of foods that are on offer. Because there's so little research with carbon calculators, this has not been documented at all, but there is some preliminary research with things like food and other sustainability, or sorry, carbon and other sustainability labels on foods, where companies are doing audits to lower the footprint of their foods before there's even any legislation that requires it, and doing that so that they can look better, and also in case the consumer demand does drastically shift, that they'll be prepared for that. So I think in the kind of consumer areas of technology and clothing and food, there's a lot of potential for people becoming aware of the types of products that they want, then exerting that kind of influence. I also think that a valuable part of a carbon calculator is seeing what you're not able to change through your own behavior. So the main goal is obviously to encourage people to lower their own emissions in various sectors, but there are some things like home energy that might be incredibly prohibitive, costly for people to do on their own. And I think that by doing a carbon calculator and realizing what a large portion of your footprint that is, it can also be used to encourage more collective civic political engagement. And I don't think that's currently very well addressed within calculators that are online, but I think a wise design for if a government was, for example, to create a carbon calculator would be to have more of that included of, you know, where do you see as an individual that you can't make changes, and how can we help make sure that those things are possible? Melinda? Oh. Yeah, so the feed, like the tips that we were providing them. Yeah, so there were 4 different tips that could be provided. It was either to do with their clothing purchases, their food, their flying, or their driving. All of the tips were centered around like a 50% reduction, regardless of what the domain was. So the example that I gave with food was saying if you replaced half of these meat proteins with other proteins, it would reduce by a certain amount. And those were all calculated not on an average, but for each participant. So it was saying like, based on exactly what you ate or what you claimed to eat in the past, this is how much it would go down. It was the same thing with flights. If they put that they had taken 10 flights, we would say if you took half those many flights, this is the emissions you would save. Yeah, clothing, if you shopped, either bought used clothing or didn't buy half as much, this is how much. And again, for driving, it was, they had input how much money they spent per month on gasoline and diesel. And so the recommendation there was, again, reducing by 50% their gas or their diesel consumption would lead to this amount of change. The recommendations could be another thing to look at in the future when delineating like how important different things are, to see whether larger recommendations like completely eliminating one part, like, you know, going completely plant-based, what the emissions reductions from that would be, versus having much smaller recommendations like having a meat-free Monday or whatever it would be. I'm not sure at this point which of those would be most effective. So we kind of went with a middle ground of 50% for all of them. Yeah, Melinda? Yeah. Yes. Okay. So the carbon offset allocation was a question in the survey where participants were told that one person would be drawn at random to win a $100 bonus. And they had to decide then if they got the bonus, whether they would want to, how much of it they would want to keep and how much they would want to put towards carbon offsets. There was a paragraph explaining carbon offsets and the fact that we would be putting it into a renewable energy offset, not like a forestry one. And so this was a true behavioral measure and not just a hypothetical one, because we did go through and select somebody at random and allocate the money as they had said. So it was a continuous measure. This was the Yeah, it's a pretty common measure, even in MTurk surveys, to have various different donations. I've never seen it to carbon offsets. Like that was purposely designed to more closely align with a carbon calculator, but a number of different studies use a similar bonus money setup for donations to various different, for example, environmental organizations. And there have been significant effects before, because even if many MTurkers are not donating with a large enough sample size, there are still enough people who are that there could be a difference between groups. So I think this was more indicative of it, either that people didn't like or didn't feel familiar enough with carbon offsets, they didn't want to donate, and that's why there was maybe less of a difference, or just that the intervention wasn't influencing their thoughts regarding this. Yeah. Yeah, I don't, I would agree that it's also an awful job. And yeah, I've heard worries too, and read quite a bit about different opinions from people who've specifically studied MTurk and people's enjoyment and use of MTurk. And I know that for people who are using MTurk, they were asked what percentage extra they'd have to work in a like more normal job that had, you know, conventional hours and more conventional job. And people said that they'd have to be paid, I don't remember what the exact figure was, but a lot more than what they were currently being paid on MTurk for it to be worthwhile for them, because they appreciated the flexibility, and a lot of people are just using it for fun. So I think there is a bit of a misconception about the population. It's definitely not representative of the public, but they are more middle class and like close to an average salary than I think is often depicted.
Any reflections based on doing this? I thought it was really interesting when you were commenting on the potential effects of COVID. COVID was one of the real life exploration of big change. More people are not emphasize that there might be a rebound in terms of like the overall people weren't able to rebound and how they are. I think there are any other sorts of about in general coming forward. Any questions you want to
ask? So the question was about behavior change and COVID, and kind of both related to the study and just in general, how people have come to see their ability to change over the course of the pandemic. I think there's one interesting thing, I don't have a slide on it, but we did include a rough proxy for a COVID index of how shut down different states were. And I definitely expected that people who were shut down more would want to rebound more and like fly more places and do that stuff. And it was the opposite that we found. It was a very small effect, but it was actually that people who were more shut down intended to have lower footprints moving forward, which I think might attest to that kind of notion that people who were more shut down saw, oh, it is more feasible for me to work from home or to do these various things, and that's a possibility. I think it's also very likely that it's heterogeneous, and there's people who are rebounding to the extreme and who are staying at home to the extreme, and that those are balancing out to have a very small effect. So yeah, I think it's very interesting to see how things go back after COVID. But yeah, that's kind of the one data part from this that I can share.
I think about feedback that I get and one thing that I always look at is they tell you how you're doing in comparison to your neighbor. And so not only are they giving you feedback on your own usage, but how it compares to other people that are in the comparison. And I don't know if this is outside of the scope of the research, but I was trying to see any thoughts you might have on like the power of you not to just get feedback about what you're doing in relation to what you've done in the past.
Yeah, so for everyone on Zoom, the question is about social comparison to other people, and that on your energy bill, you can see how you're doing, but on this carbon calculator, we're just offering information about your own footprint and not how you compared to others. So that's something that we definitely talked about in the design. It is a common feature online for existing carbon calculators to give that comparison of this is how other people are doing who make the same amount of money as you or who live in a similar area or things like that. Those do exist. For the purpose of this study, we left it out because it would add a layer of complexity that might lead to people reacting in divergent directions. So if they were above average, it would maybe give more incentive to get down, like that would be quite likely. But for anybody who is below average, there could be that reverse of what we want, and they're gonna try to start going up to what is considered average. And that's definitely something that can be looked at in the future. We just entail more groups within the design. And I think it would just depend how you communicated it. Like definitely just telling people that they're below average and leaving it at that would, I would imagine, not be a very effective for the kinds of ends that we want. But if you attach that with communication that you're doing a great thing and you need to keep it up and such along those lines, I think it could definitely be useful. And similarly, we included a 50% reduction target instead of an absolute target for the same reason of not wanting people to be above and below it. But I think many people would benefit more from seeing a specific number that everyone's trying to get down to, that it would feel more fair for everyone, and that, that people would be curious about that. So I think those are all definitely worthwhile things to look into further before launching a more like official platform to help people with this.